and welcome. My name is Herminder Ray, and I will be your host for this TLC session. Thank you for joining us for My Life Was Our Life, a literary approach to institutional equity. Please welcome Teresa Kirk.
Thank you, Herminder. I'm really grateful for the chance to share my studies with all of you today. I have all of my friends in the San Diego conference room here, so that's nice. So I have a PhD in comparative literature with a focus on Russia and Eastern Europe. And I think that sometimes scholars of literature feel a little insecure with the perceived economic or social value of their work. For example, I imagine that right now, all of you is wondering what in the world a study of a little known writer, Karl Čapek, from a tiny country at turn of the century Europe, Czechoslovakia, has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion in the theory and practice of online education. And my answer to that question is a whole heck of a lot for a couple of reasons. First, literature scholarship overall is about how people through history have sought to understand the world as it changes, to be understood, and then to give shape to that knowledge in everyday life. So the ability to analyze narrative structure, its form, the cultural context it has, and to articulate that analysis is one of those durable, adaptable, and transferable skills that's the crux of Ashford's mission and a general goal of higher education. Secondly, literature itself spans all media, making it an ideal venue for the expression of diversity, which is a critical quality in the context of the digital space, like our online classroom. Karl Čapek addressed this phenomenon in his writings on how the radio wasn't just a technical, but an epistemological advancement. In other words, the radio changed how people know themselves, each other, and the world. When the radio appeared, the luxury of knowing only one's insular community disappeared. Technology like the radio was full of potential. It could lead to a more ethical future, but only if it were harnessed in the right way, that fostered connections among people, instead of enabling xenophobia or ideological conflicts. For this reason, Čapek was invested in the future of education and the new and very diverse Czechoslovak nation state. Education must build a nuanced understanding, or in Čapek's words, an anxious attentiveness to everything that exists of this vast world, which the radio had just made much more accessible to more people. This discussion of the radio parallels a current consideration of the value of digitally mediated communication, which we rely on for online learning. The internet has made the wide world even smaller and more accessible, but it also has facilitated the creation of restricted and sheltered epistemological bubbles. Gary Robson's chapter in the book Digital Diversities, Social Media and the Intercultural Experience discusses this issue. Robson writes, "There is little doubt that social media enables sojourning students to psychologically anchor themselves at home in a highly meaningful cocoon community, however disassociated from the surrounding cultural reality that cocoon may be. But the repeated appeal to reality seems also to point in the other direction, to hint at a desire for or less mediated experience. Living in the cocoon and remaining at the center of a gadget-anchored universe actually inhibits the risky and demanding project of opening oneself to the cultural other in a meaningful and potentially transformative sense." Like Čapek grappled with how a disembodied radio experience could create a new, broader, and more ethical sense of community amid diversity, we as online educators strive to ensure that the disembodied digital learning experience coaxes students out of their own cocoon communities and allows them to understand their connections to their cultural others. This study of one of Čapek's most significant novels offers a concrete approach to doing just that. One moment, please. Okay, so I've chosen this picture to set the stage for the environment of Čapek's writing, and because Zoidberg from Futurama is one of my favorite characters. And as silly as it seems, this image gives us a useful set of questions to think about. How can we reimagine our identities outside of the lines that historically have defined them, like this redrawn map of Europe here? And also, why not reimagine them? What possibilities arise when we choose to do so? And how can we impart this in how we teach our students? So please consider these questions as you listen to this tale of interwar Central and Eastern Europe. Jaroslav Hašek, is a Czech writer famous for his satire on political and ideological loyalty. He confronts the presumption that there can be an absolute definition of national identity in his short story, Shake the Dust from Your Shoes, from 1918. The story's main character, a soldier, is traveling home to Prague from the Eastern Front after the end of World War I. At a Red Cross camp along the way, he witnesses the chaos that ensues when volunteers ask the refugees to line up for supplies according to their nationalities. No one knows which line to join. And one man, absolutely paralyzed with confusion, just bursts into tears. Is the tearful refugee better off lining up according to linguistic or religious affinities, to the place his parents came from, or to the borders in which his home exists now? Furthermore, given how easily borders changed after World War I, will the nationality of the line he chooses always be true for him? Hašek doesn't directly pose these questions, but he suggests that national identity is not the clear result of some intrinsic quality or a historical inheritance, but is relative to environment and needs. In this scene, embracing an identity is like deciding which line looks best. And by Hašek's example, national identity in interwar Central and Eastern Europe was paradoxical. Was it possible to simultaneously be nationalistic and relativistic? As this study will show, the new Czechoslovak identity needed to be both as it developed in the interwar period. The writings of novelist, playwright, and journalist Karel Čapek established a unique aesthetic of cognitive flexibility that reconciles nationalism and relativism, and that could help Czechoslovak people successfully situate themselves in this evolving geopolitical context. Now, nationalism assumes an absolute and exclusive collective identity based on shared characteristics like language, religion, and cultural traditions. In contrast, relativity rejects the absolute and asserts the variability of truth and of interpretations of the world depending on an individual's location and perspective. Relativism is the worldview that accepts the concept of relativity. But just as relativity asserts that truths are variable, applications of relativism are varied as well. For example, Franz Boas's doctrine of cultural relativism says that there are multiple possible moral truths because cultures determine morals and cultures themselves are diverse. On the other hand, there's a much more nihilistic relativism that abandons the attempt to ascertain truth at all and instead resigns itself to the notion that man is the measure of all things. Both of these types of relativism fall into a category of passive tolerance of individualism, which would preclude absolute collective nationalist sentiments. But the complicated interplay between absolute nationalism and relativism was critical in post-World War I Central Europe, where brand new nation states were arising amidst what once were fluid borders within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Often the basis for the formation of new nationalities was historic right, or the notion that there exists a single history of a region and its people, and that specific history defines the nation as a whole and separates it from the others. Perceptions of the past, relative because of the differences in individuals' memories, were being employed as absolutes that would define the collective future of Central and Eastern European nations. In the article O relativismu, or On Relativism, published in 1926, Čapek argues that relativism is not an unquestioning tolerance, but, quote, an anxious attentiveness to everything that exists. This attentiveness is necessary for people to become well-rounded wholes, which is preferable to being one-dimensional automatons or ideologues, which is a characteristic which Čapek insinuates belongs to the Marxists, whose influence was rising at the time. Marxists believed that an absolute historical causality defined the world from the past to the present and into the future. But, according to Čapek, as for Einstein's relativity, I admit frankly that I don't understand it, just as I don't understand some religious mysteries, the logic of history, infinite space, and such like. I tried to study it. I got to the point where it states that if I moved with the velocity of light, I'd, for some numerical reasons, get flattened like a biscuit. And then I gave up on the rest, very much reconciled that I don't move with the velocity of light. Because I move slowly and thoughtfully, I'd become round rather than anything else, and I wouldn't like to be flat. Some people who hurl themselves forward with enormous speed and who are ahead, as they say, of their time, really are remarkably flat. This exposition of relativity relates to Čapek's socio-political stance, which he articulates in several writings about the new Czechoslovak national program. One of these is a collection of thoughts and reminiscences from the first president of the Czechoslovak First Republic, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. In his conversations with Čapek, Masaryk notes the complicated, diverse, and interrelated histories that constitute the new Czechoslovak nation state. And Čapek shared Masaryk's mission to develop a nation that was, quote, free in terms other than those claimed by 19th century nationalist ideology, and to establish a new sense of Czechoslovak patriotism that embraces all ethnicities of the Czech lands, focusing on shared needs rather than solely on distinctive national pasts. With these nuanced ideas of Czechoslovak nationhood in mind, I argue that Čapek's work exemplifies a mode of storytelling that inspires individually to continually and actively choose how they define themselves, therefore creating a framework for a cognitively flexible nation. This reading of Čapek helped us to understand a cultural strategy for reconciling individual uniqueness with collective sentiment, which in interwar Central and Eastern Europe was imperative to creating a national identity that could respond to crises, such as internal socio-political feuding, disparate cultural programs, and the threat of invasion. Between 1932 and 1934, when Czechoslovakia was feeling the pressure of Hitler's ascent to Germany, Čapek composed what is now known as the most successful attempt at a philosophical novel in any language. His trilogy of books, Pordubal and Meteor from 1932, and Obyčejný život, or An Ordinary Life from 1934. An Ordinary Life is a memoir whose subject suspects that a simple and clearly defined life story does not truly represent his identity. Like the other novels in the trilogy, An Ordinary Life has shifting narrative perspective. In contrast to the other novels, its varying narrative points of view exist within one subject. The memoir's narrator enters into a process of listening to a chorus of third-person voices, which are simultaneously his own, and which appear only in connection with specific life events. This narrative movement suggests that people are not simply the sum of past events that place them into a particular collective mold, like being a Czech or German nationalist or a Marxist, for example, but are conglomerations of possible identities that are relative to the needs of specific moments in everyday life. I examined An Ordinary Life through the lens of two schools of thought, with which both President Masaryk and Karel Čapek interacted, and which are critical to this consideration of the relationship between past and present, and between the individual and the collective. The theories of Henri Bergson and William James's American pragmatist philosophy. Elements of Bergson and James's ideas define Čapek's nationalist relativism and that they demonstrate an accessible way for individuals to come to understand and enact a Czechoslovak national program that fosters an inclusive and adaptive identity. Both philosophies maintain that the past is a living entity, our understanding of which evolves based on our present circumstances, and which continually alters the way we see ourselves in the world. Additionally, they suggest that we most productively make decisions about how we see ourselves in the world when we approach our circumstances from a position of what Jamesian pragmatism calls last things first. In other words, what are the most practical and useful outlooks and behaviors for the goals that we need to achieve? Channeling these ideas, An Ordinary Life is an aesthetic answer to President Masaryk's national call to action because it allows for imagining a national identity that is fluid and connective, not just opposed from without by an absolute bureaucratic conception of the past, but redefined continually from within and among individuals. Čapek's work about regular, everyday people who have tangible beliefs and goals, make mistakes, learn, and change their minds clearly illustrate the flexible choice-making process that is reflective of the Bergsonian and pragmatist philosophies with which he engaged. The fictional memoir in Čapek's An Ordinary Life illustrates how a man relearns his personal history, recognizing the fluidity of his identity and the connections to other people that it fostered in his life. The memoir begins when the narrator realizes he's likely to die soon, and he decides to get his affairs in order. Since every document, letter, and scrap of paper related to his life is neatly categorized, there's nothing left for him to do but to organize his memories. And so he begins to write his life story. He believes that he is the sum of his life events and that his identity has been defined by a mechanism of habit and chance. According to this mechanism, the narrator recounts his childhood memories with the phrase "spominam si," or "I remember." And from this first-person perspective, his first attempt to tell his life story is indeed mechanistic. He remembers what one is supposed to. He loved his parents, was diligent in school, worked hard, was good to his wife, and was loyal to his friends. But amidst these first-person descriptions, the narrative perspective shifts almost unnoticeably, suggesting that there's something more to the mechanistic version of the memoir. Specifically, accounts of the narrator's own actions, as opposed to his reflections about other people, are told by a third-person voice who looks down on the narrator as a boy, a young man, and then an adult. These early shifts in narrative viewpoint foreshadow the ultimate revelation the narrator of An Ordinary Life has. As he's recovering from a heart attack that he suffered after having completed his life story, the narrator notices two voices are arguing. I distinguish them quite clearly. One voice says that the narrator's oversimplified account of his life is evidence of his desire to have his own world that is cut off from all the others. And the rest of An Ordinary Life consists of accounts of numerous other voices, which assert the variability of truths in the narrator's life experience and demonstrate how his behavior actually has changed to allow him to connect his world to others. By the time the memoir ends, about 8 different voices, though the narrator acknowledges that there are many more than that, emerge to explain how the narrator's outlook in the world and behaviors changed with each of his life circumstances. And here's a little illustration from another of his stories, many of which have this same theme of all the different arguing voices inside one person's head. The identity that these voices uncover include a poet, a lover, a freedom fighter. The list can go on. And each of these identities directly relates to the people with whom the narrator was interacting at particular points in his life. Most importantly, the narrator comes to realize that none of these identities ever disappeared. Rather, they moved from the background to the foreground according to changes in the narrator's existence. And for him, they represent possibility. He realizes, my life was our life, of us who long ago lived and died, and of us who perhaps were not born, but only might have been. The reinterpretation of a personal history that results in An Ordinary Life's narrator's new conception of his identity reflects Bergsonian and pragmatist theories on the relationship among the past and present by pointing out that the narrator's life was not mechanistic and organized, a series of events that were consummated in the formation of a single unified identity. Rather, this memoir asserts the need for active choice, which an initial scene illustrates. 2 men are conversing in a garden when one pauses to tend to his roses. He bends over to break off a wild stem and comments, "Take a peek at how this stem would like to become a rose hip. To keep it in order, we must keep that other rose down, that wild one." The man's reflection on what he does to the wild rose foreshadows what the memoir's narrator attempts to do with his life story, to use the past to push down all potential identities that exist within him and to close himself off from the rest of the world. Only when he hears the chorus of voices within him does he come to realize a person simply has his own particular vision of himself and of his life. And according to that, he chooses a fact or edits it a little so that it affirms his vision. The narrator's newly realized voices allow him to see that the choices he made in his life continually changed his identity and allowed him to build bridges to others in his world. Connecting diverse peoples was a critical element of social and political questions when Čapek was writing his philosophical trilogy. And by the late 1930s, historical absolutes were making this type of connection seem impossible. It was the eve of the 1938 Munich Agreement, and Čapek feared that Germany was relying too much on historical inheritance to define its current course of action. In History Lesson, a 1938 article in the journal Przytomność, or The Present, Čapek argues that Germans' worldview has solidified around their history, and consequently Germany has closed itself off from the rest of Europe. His remarks on Germany recall the narrator of An Ordinary Life, whose first attempt at a memoir presents history as a means of reasserting a static identity and organizing one's world into a little bubble. But Čapek's nationalist relativism shows how an individual can continually reform his or her personal identity by being anxiously attentive to new information about both the past and the present. If individuals can redefine themselves according to new information and new experiences, then a nation could as well. This type of flexible thinking persisted even through Czechoslovakia's socialist years in the form of dissidents that didn't simply trade one absolute, like communism, for another, like Western-style capitalism. Particularly the work of playwright and first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, defines dissidence as a decision-making process that forgoes ideology. Likewise, contemporary theorists in the context of broader social challenges like LGBT rights, race, and religious issues have taken up arguments like Havel's and Čapek's. Judith Butler, for example, proposes in her groundbreaking book, Gender Trouble, a fluidity of gender identity that in turn opens society to coalitional activism, which is a flexible affiliation based on immediate need rather than a membership to an organization, or as Gary Robson calls them in a digital world, cocoon communities, which are fossilized in historic tradition or ideology. Now, as the reassertion of populist tendencies in contemporary Central and Eastern Europe, and frankly in many digital arenas, again brings conflicting historical absolutes to the fore. The cognitive flexibility that Čapek illustrates in this novel, which is an openness to reevaluating historical ideologies and changing our minds about how we see ourselves, continues to serve as a useful example of the connections, both individually and on an international level, that could be, instead of the divisions that history has written into stone. And I will close by sharing some examples of how we can apply lessons like these in the relationships about the relationships between narrative form and cultural context to our interactions with students, faculty, with each other as staff. And I hope if there's time after this that people could share some ideas of their own with tangible ways we can apply these in the classroom. One idea is that after introductory classroom discussions, we can have students identify a shared classroom goal and then articulate based on what they've learned about each other, specifically how their differences will allow them to accomplish this goal. Not their shared experiences, but how will the differences work together to reach this new idea, new collective idea. Also in debates, either among students in the classroom or the ones that we always have at work, we can all practice articulating a circumstance in which we could see ourselves siding with someone who's arguing an opposing point. This is a pragmatist idea of starting with last things first. What is the goal we're searching for, and how might we reconsider how we see ourselves in order to reach that goal together? And then finally, when we listen to each other's stories, even if they're coming out in an academic narrative, we can listen closely for fluctuations in narrative voice so that we can understand maybe the origins of certain people's ideas, the outcomes that they actually are seeking, and then figure out how we can use this information to build bridges between each other. Thank you for your time, and I hope to hear more about discussions of how we can apply this lesson in narrative form to our everyday lives.
Thank you, Teresa. And if anyone wants to chime in through the chat, and I did open it up, so if you want to unmute yourself to participate, please feel free to.
So Teresa, this is Margie. I just listened or hosted a session by Perry Markison on interlinguistic and intralinguistic translation as a way to increase rhetorical awareness. And some of the examples that she gave in her presentation fit with some of the issues that you're talking about. And she brought it into the classroom with and one of the participants added to with ideas for how to make this dynamic in one of our classrooms. And so to summarize one of her examples, there was cases. Let's say you have movies with captions. The students can look at different movies and talk about how the captions reflect a different slant on the rhetorical task to accomplish in that place in the movie. And anyway, have you ever? I had never heard of this way of working with language to explore the differences in language and experiences. Does this sound like something you've pursued in your academic career?
Yes, this definitely does. And I've actually used that tactic in foreign language classes that I've taught. There are theorists who argue that every narrative that we ever tell is an act of self-translation. Because one has an idea in their mind of how they actually think, but then that goes through a filter that accommodates that or accommodates an audience and accommodates how that person wants to be perceived. So I think in the context of what I'm studying with Chapek, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that process of self-translation is, a part of that act of reconsidering your own beliefs, your own outlook, being anxiously attentive of all of your circumstances, and finding some rapprochement with everyone you're interacting with so that you can attain a common goal. And for translation, obviously, that's just to be understood.
I hope we get to do some of this in the future, Ashford, especially writing across the curriculum type movements. Thanks for your great.
Yeah, and I am actually very much interested in seeing Prairie's presentation, so I'll look forward to when that's posted.
Cool.
I mean, we could just talk about Zoidberg here for a second and how cute he is.
Well, we still have a few more minutes if anyone else wants to chime in or participate in the chat or ask any additional questions.
Well, I appreciate everyone's listening. I know this was definitely a mouthful, but I think there's an opportunity to look at structure of how folks are communicating with us and how we communicate back with them. Sort of read between the lines and see how we can compromise with each other.
All right. Well, thank you, Teresa, for your presentation and for everyone attending as well today. We hope you enjoy the rest of your TLC sessions this week.